no alternative. The only solution now is we go for the federal Europe, all of us. Some of us won't do it anyhow. And I think that's in Brussels' attitude as well. Tough. Let them go. All right? Well, that will be what happens. I think it great harm for Europe as well as the UK, and I believe there will be other countries too, that will be forced out of this union by their own people. If you go reluctantly into a political union and you have to face 4 or 5 years of very high unemployment, cuts in standards of living, you will be, in my view, torn apart by your people. You must, if you go into these political unions, at least go with what Ted Heath called the full-hearted consent of the British people. He didn't get it in 73, but we did get it in the referendum of 75. It's lasted thereafter. But these are, I'm getting into telling you what to do. That's your choice. All I'm saying, all I can say is, as good Europeans, we should try to find solutions which, as far as possible, meet as many of the aspirations and needs of the member states of the European Union. And so my answer to Giorgio, again, is, remember the single market is not a free trade area. It is much more than this. It is a customs union, but it also has attached to it, in the European Economic Area, social policies. So there is some way of trying to keep social costs across. It is committed to the social market, and it also has environmental policies. And we all know environmental policies have huge costs for industry, and if not shared right across, you can have competitive advantage. So I think what we want to do is to fashion that social market in a way that meets your objection, and I accept intellectually there is an argument about this, but allows those people who want to be part of a European Union and a country, and there are a lot of our young who do have a very, idealistic view of Europe. They've got used to traveling at the age of 13 or 14 around Europe. Some of them are multiple European languages, and it may be that that generation can do this. And I'm very against prescribing for a younger generation. I don't know what they're going to do. All I see, therefore, is keep flexible and keep European, and don't let's separate out. And I just don't see any advantage in that.
Istituto Affari Internazionali.
Grazie. Io credo che l'idea di Lord Owen sia molto interessante da un punto di vista politico, perché ha il grande vantaggio di offrire una soluzione europea che include anche la Gran Bretagna e non la tiene fuori dal gioco europeo, e questo è molto importante per non replicare problemi e errori del passato. Però mi domando, e devo dire non sono molto sicuro che l'attuale primo ministro sia su questa stessa linea, che il signor Cameron sia su questa stessa linea. No, primo ministro britannico. Primo ministro italiano in questo momento va bene, quello britannico che mi sembra più dubbio. Ma no, però a parte questo, io non so se come noi riusciremo a uscire dall'attuale crisi dell'euro. Se dovessimo uscire nel senso di una maggiore integrazione, credo che dovremo, indubbiamente, non basterà un discorso economico, servirà un discorso di tipo politico. Sì, anche, ma servirà dare delle giustificazioni e delle motivazioni per mantenere il consenso della popolazione, che dovranno essere anche di tipo politico, di politica estera, di politica, non solo di tipo economico. E questo potrebbe creare alla fine nuovamente un problema con la Gran Bretagna, con una Gran Bretagna che rimanga soltanto nell'area mercato comune, unione doganale, non soltanto e non anche nell'area unione politica. Mi domando cosa pensa, perché questo potrebbe ricreare questa divisione che poi è rischiosa per l'Europa. Grazie.
I think it is very difficult for Europe. I keep repeating, the problem of Europe is pretension. We pretend to have a foreign policy. We don't. When the Benghazi was about to be taken over by Gaddafi forces, there comes a moment you actually have to decide. And it was probably saved by 12 hours, certainly 24 hours. Now, you let us, and for you it was a post-colonial situation, difficulty. Without your airfields, we could not have done that. The fact of the matter is that Germany and Poland decided they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So two very substantial countries opted out of it. The burden was taken by France and by Britain. But that's how most people of Europe see it. The truth is that Britain and France could not have enforced a no-fly zone without the Americans. The Americans sent 200 cruise missiles in those first 4 days, taking out the sophisticated ground-to-air missile defense systems and attack that the Gaddafi regime had placed in it. There is a total unreality in Europe about our position on defense. Every single defense secretary for the last 20 years has warned, US defense secretary has warned Europe, whether they're Democrat or Republican, that you are pretending you have a defense policy when you are relying hugely on us. There are Europeans who would bless the day that the United States took their troops away and that NATO folded up and that we live in a most modern world, we don't need this. If you are going to have an influence in the foreign policy, nobody knows this more than I. I lived in the Balkans trying to persuade people to use force to impose a settlement on the Serbs, basically. And they would not do it. And it took us 3 years, and eventually the appalling massacre of men and boys, Muslims at Srebrenica, before the world acted. All through this, Europe was pretending. Now, have aspirations to have a foreign policy that everybody agrees with. Let it evolve over years. But there are reasons why. Syria now, hugely difficult problem. Sometimes there are problems you can't solve. I think, broadly speaking, what Europe has done has been correct. But it actually means doing nothing. And I just think that this European talk is very rarely challenged by politicians. They're on the European circuit. They go to the European Parliament. They then come sometimes back from the European Parliament to their national parliaments. And I don't think Europe will solve its problems, and particularly this one. This is fundamentally an economic problem. You have to satisfy people outside Europe. This is what we have to understand. The reason why we're in this crisis is not enough people are buying government bonds in European countries. And that means people from China and Japan and Brazil and the United States and Russia and other countries. This is game over or game on. We have to decide. This is not going to be decided inside Europe. It is going to be decided by people who invest in Europe. And they are showing every signs at the moment of being totally unconvinced of every single measure that we've taken over the last 2.5 years. Every summit is hailed by a rise in stock markets, usually in Europe, but often around the world. Headline stories, great successes, politicians come back, come in front of their own national audiences, all claim victory, and then, hey presto, you start to see the unease of the rest of the world as to whether or not to invest in Europe. So there is an outside audience that's watching all this. We know about this. We were in the exchange rate mechanism, and we couldn't get an agreed reduction in revaluation. And we were taken out in the space of about 16 hours. And these forces move very fast, and they're ruthless. And we've got to face up to it. This is what you've got to satisfy. This is an economic question in which we are living on borrowed time.
I think we have time for a last question. Qualcuno ha un'ultima domanda? Giorgio Gavronski vuole dire qualcosa? Vieni a un microfono, ti danno un microfono.
As an economist, I tend to believe that there could be a technical approach to saving the Eurozone by focusing on what is strictly needed to make the currency work. And that is focus on the 2 or 3 major disequilibria that are killing the Eurozone and the Euro. and that is a central bank that is a lender of last resort, that would kill the spreads. And then the two main issues on the real economy, aside from the financial sector, that is competitiveness, differences in competitiveness, as a previous speaker outlined, and recession in aggregate demand. Now, don't you think that you have a broader vision than an economist, so maybe you could challenge this view, which is usually unchallenged. I mean, people just assume that since, that in order for the common currency to work, we just need a federal state, full stop. But there's never a deeper argument on this. So maybe you would like to elaborate on this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I agree that this is the right approach, and that we make the politics around the economic realities. And so what you say about if we were able to carry conviction to the rest of the world that the ECB was able to be in a funding position, that it could provide a last resort funding, then a lot of your problems in the immediate future would be resolved. The problem with that is that the world can add up, and they can see what we are putting forward in the fiscal compact and in the European Stability Pact. And they look at more and more the facts are beginning to emerge about Spain. I mean, we can spend too much time on Greece and Portugal and Ireland, and Ireland has got, to some extent, beginning to resolve its way. The issue the world is summing up is how much is it needed to solve the Spanish problem. And they're starting to look at also what is the needed for the Italian problem. And there, it becomes immediately clear that Mario Draghi, who I think is doing a very good job as ECB chairman, he has to face up to various things. He operates under a treaty provision which has a no bailout clause in it. That's one problem. He also has German members, though they only have one vote, they basically are the people who will give the resources to the ECB. Now, if you look at the calculations of the amount of money the ECB has already spent as at risk, I saw the other day €1 trillion. These are big sums. And who is going to run behind it? And what Angela Merkel is constantly saying, we will not do this until this discipline framework is in place. And she's not going to any longer just accept promises. There are going to be no substantial checks or guarantees of sufficiency to give credibility to the ECB having last resort, unless the Germans are satisfied that there is this discipline framework. But in theory, there is no doubt that would solve it. And one of the reasons why you need a single country to run a single currency is that you do have a Federal Reserve Bank with all the range of powers that are available, and that there's no doubt Draghi would like to have. But it can't have it on nothing. And we're on empty, basically. There is already in the pipeline commitments that rational people can see for the countries that are at the weakest in the Eurozone, which is more than has been put down on the table by the European Union governments. That is the problem. And that's why I think the last summit, for all its some important improvements that they made in the situation. But again, last resort is a good word. But the other one is that you will not give, in your loans, you will not give a preference to EU loans. The wording I forgot is, there's this technical word. Well, that's now immediately been examined more and more when they look at what they're really saying. That's seniority, isn't it? Senior debt. It isn't what people left Brussels thinking had been given. And you have to, if you're going to get a country to put some money there, they've got to think they've got a very goodish chance of getting it back. Otherwise, they won't give it to the ECB to put on the line. So we're already seeing that qualification resume. Yet, if you don't give some leeway on this, and governments claim to be in front of private investors will panic and take their money out. So this is another technical question, which of itself has huge political implications. Then you spoke about competitiveness. This is the nub of it all. Schroeder, when he was a SPD chancellor, seeing that the German economy in 2000, 2002 was getting uncompetitive, went to the trade unions and hammered out a program to cut German labor costs. It's easy to forget, but that's what they did. Without devaluation, over a period of 3 to 4 years, the Germans made themselves more competitive broadly by agreement between unions and management. They have this system, which I think there is a lot of merit in which there is structured dialogue between management and unions. It's not everybody else's cup of tea, but it works in Germany. It allows them to do things which we would find great difficult. Britain had that relationship with the unions twice under Labour governments. It lasted about 2 years. It was quite successful for 2 years, but then it burst out. It didn't have this. The German, Schroeder, in my view, is very responsible for the present success and competitiveness of industry. Now, there is an argument, and it is a fair argument to put, that Germany has also gained from the euro currency. Instead of their Deutschmark going up and up in value and then starting to price themselves out in world markets, the euro currency, because of the weaknesses elsewhere, has been kept down, and Germany has profited by that, and they have their export industry. And I think it is important that German politicians spend a little time saying to their own public, look, we've actually gained quite a lot out of the euro currency to help them. But that's they must fight that battle, that's their issue. But I'm only really pointing out that these there are known solutions to the Eurozone crisis. And David Cameron, who actually I don't think disagrees totally with me, and far from totally, I think he probably agrees with me. He has certain limitations in his party of people who want to get out. But I don't think he would disagree broadly with it. But the issue which David Cameron gets up the nose of the Europeans is he says the simplicities of what to do with a single currency, as if you're talking about America. And so we know, the Americans know how to handle this. They've got the powers, the Federal Reserve, they've got the powers to tax and change and alter the structures. Even so, they leave the states alone to a great extent. Look at California. And I think you have to face this fact. This is the problem. The economics and the politics are meshed together. You can't separate them out. And it's this combination of the politicians not being realistic enough about the economy and the economists not being realistic enough about the politics has led to 2.5 years of failure to grapple with the Eurozone problem. And you're still failing to grapple with it.
Well, grazie, è stata una interessantissima conferenza. Grazie molto Lord Owen per averci fatto questa gioia di averlo con lui. Quando nel 1964, se non ricordo male, il 14 gennaio del 64, il generale de Gaulle interruppe i negoziati per l'ingresso dell'Inghilterra nel mercato comune, l'argomento che venne usato fu che l'Inghilterra, avendo questo forte spirito di indipendenza, non era compatibile con il programma di fondo della Unione Europea, della Federazione Europea. Io ho sempre pensato che tra un'Europa federata senza l'Inghilterra e un'Europa meno federata o confederata, ma con dentro l'Inghilterra, io preferisco questa seconda ipotesi, nel senso che il buonsenso, lo spirito democratico, l'apertura al mondo delle classi dirigenti inglesi è qualcosa di molto prezioso non solo per il loro paese ma anche per l'Europa, e che quindi un'Europa che escludesse dal suo core, dal suo corpo stretto l'Inghilterra sarebbe una Europa più povera dal punto di vista culturale e politico. Credo che sarebbe lo stesso anche per l'Inghilterra se si autoescludesse dall'Europa, ma penso che questa conferenza dimostri che l'Europa ha bisogno di questa riflessione politica che la loro leadership è in grado oggi di fare e di guardare il modo di guardare i problemi del mondo. Lo ringrazio molto David e spero che ci sarà ancora occasione di sentirti su questi temi. Grazie.